And joining me for more now from Panama City, Florida, Paul Craig Roberts, former Reagan administration official. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I want to ask you what you think is really going on. Is NATO failing here? Are the rebels turning on them? Is NATO losing faith that they can get this done militarily and oust Gaddafi as the U.S. wants?
Well, you ask a very good question. I think it's even broader. You know, if you look at this whole Libyan episode, it's quite different from the other protests in the other Arab countries. First of all, it didn't break out in the capital city like all the others. It took place in the eastern part of Libya where the oil is and where China has vast investments.
You mentioned China. You actually believe that the United States is trying to conspire against China with their actions in Libya. How do you figure?
Well, I don't know exactly what I believe, but that certainly comes to mind. China has, according to their own reports, 50 large-scale energy and construction investments in Libya. And China is relying on Africa for its future energy needs, you know, Angola, Nigeria, and Libya. And so what we may see here is the United States taking advantage of the protest movement to evict China from its energy sources.
Well, hold on a minute. If that is the case, you know, this was all passed. This began with a UN resolution. China could have vetoed it. Why wouldn't they have if the stakes were so high for them?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. One, they may not have been ready for a confrontation with the United States. Two, they may simply say, well, you know, we're going to lose our investments, but the Americans are getting in even deeper. Three, they may have thought that the resolution meant what it said. It obviously has already gone way beyond the resolution. The no-fly zone did not permit the use of NATO forces in attacking Gaddafi. It was only to keep his planes and helicopter gunships out of the air. But it's now turned into part of the military force for the rebels. Another big difference is that these rebels are armed.
Who do you think arming them? Who do you think is arming them? Do you think the United States is arming them at all? What do you make of the reports? You know, we have those reports that Obama signed off for the CIA to be training rebels, and we saw in our report from our RT correspondent that there's belief that that is going on. Do you think that the United States is arming these rebels?
It's certainly likely, because if the CIA is training them, then they probably also are arming them. But I think the most important point is, irrespective of who's arming them, is that this is an armed rebellion. The others were not. There was no armed rebellion in Egypt or Tunisia. There's no armed rebellion in Bahrain and really not even in Yemen. There are protesters collecting themselves in the capital cities and defying authority, but they're not armed. They're not engaged in military conflict. So the whole situation in Libya is totally different from all the others for the reasons I gave. And so that then raises questions about what really is going on there.
What do you think really is going on there? I mean, now we see the rebels calling for NATO to do more. We see the rebels angry with what NATO is doing. We see a former United States congressman going to speak with Gaddafi. We see a diplomatic envoy from the U.S. and other Western allies going to meet with the rebels and indirectly speak with Gaddafi. So do you think that NATO is kind of feeling like the military effort isn't working and are looking for another route, a diplomatic route?
Well, the real question is, why is NATO there?
Why is NATO there? To protect civilians?
The NATO is a North American treaty organization. It was formed to defend Western Europe from a Soviet invasion. But it's now fighting a war in Africa.
Well, but it's gotten far from its original goals for a long time now. So why do you think NATO is there?
Because the United States wants them there.
The United States isn't in the lead anymore, though.
But of course, the United States leads NATO.
Well, the United States leads NATO, so you think it's all just a ploy that the United States has kind of seemingly stepped back and hand over authority to NATO?
Well, we know NATO wouldn't be there if the United States didn't want them to be there. So then that raises the question, why does the United States want them to be there?
Why does the United States? What do you think the end game is for the United States now?
I think the end game is to get rid of that regime for several reasons. One, it breaks up China's oil supply from Libya. Two, it gets rid of Gaddafi, who refused to join the United States African Command. You know, we've set up an African Command in 2007, and the purpose, I think, was to counteract China's economic penetration of Africa with American military organization. So we've got 49 of the African countries in the United States African Command. Gaddafi refused. So that's another reason to warn him out. And a third reason is he's not a U.S. puppet, and so the Americans don't completely control the Mediterranean coast.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the Mediterranean, one issue I want to bring up, you've written a little bit about Syria, where there is some, protests and going on now. Do you think that the United States, Syria is much closer to a Libya as far as its relation to the United States than Egypt or other countries where we've seen protests, Bahrain, Yemen. Do you think that Washington would get involved in Syria?
I think that's the intention. You see, Syria provides the Russian naval base in the Mediterranean.
How would it ever fly, though? Because Russia has a base in Syria. Russia would, it would never get past the UN Security Council, I don't think.
Well, they won't necessarily go to the UN Security Council.
What do you think they do?
They would just act. Or they will say, oh, these terrible things are happening. We've got to save the Syrian people. You know, who knows what they'll do? They'll do what they think they can get away with. And I can't predict that, but all I can observe is that in the case of Syria and Libya, there are these differences.
Okay.
If they can, if they can overthrow those countries, they can get Russia out of the Mediterranean and they can get China out of the Mediterranean, and that is probably a goal of the people in Washington.
So you have three big players, Russia, China, the United States, that kind of could all be pitted against each other in these two countries. Do you think that this will escalate to a much larger issue between these three world powers?
It could. That's a risk. I think the Americans are being too aggressive, given the nature of the risk for miscalculation. There is a risk.
Just really quickly, what do you think it would take for there to be a tipping point? What would the U.S. do that would make that tipping point?
If they push too hard.
Well, what's pushing too hard?
You know, I don't know how China and Russia will view their national interest, or what they would think is threatening. I can't predict that because I'm not inside their minds. But somewhere along the line, there has to be a trip point where you push too far. And the Americans are full of hubris, arrogance, and they don't mind using military power to extend their reach. And they just may push too far. You never know. It's certainly not a risk that I think should be taken. You know, if they want to do something like this, they better be sure that it's not interpreted by other nuclear powers as a threat to their own security interests.
And we'll have to wait and see how this all is perceived and if it does reach a tipping point. But I appreciate you weighing in. That was Paul Cray Roberts, former Reagan administration official.